Nestled in the heart of America is a quaint town called Hartford, Wisconsin. It's one of those places where everybody knows everybody. People visit for its charming downtown, home to the largest automobile museum in the state. There's also Dave's Lanes, a beloved local bowling alley known for its cheap beer and the locally made Leroy Meats pizzas, the best pizza you'll ever taste. Around the corner from the museum and Dave's Lanes are two other hotspots. Scoop de Ville, a 1950s-style ice cream parlor famous for its raspberry sundaes, and the Mine Shaft, a cozy, family-friendly restaurant serving comfort food with an arcade for the kids. On warm days, you'll find Hartford residents strolling the wooded trails of Woodlawn and Willowbrook, two well-maintained parks just outside the downtown area. Whether the weather's good or bad, locals pack into the Shower Arts Center to watch the community theater perform. It's a peaceful town, full of Midwestern charm, but Hartford isn't famous for any of these attractions. People know Hartford, Wisconsin because of Jessie Blodgett. Jessie was born in 1994 in Atlanta, Georgia, to her adoring parents, Buck and Joy Blodgett. For years, the couple had struggled to have a child. They were just beginning to accept that they might never have biological children when, out of the blue, Joy discovered she was pregnant. It felt like a miracle. Jessie was born at home, with no doctors or drugs, just Buck, his mother, and a midwife. From the moment she took her first breath, Buck and Joy were completely in love with her. Not long after Jessie's birth, the Blodgett family left Atlanta for Hartford, Wisconsin, where they moved into a modest two-story home just 5 minutes from downtown. It was inside that home, years later, that Jessie would come face to face with a nightmare. But before we get there, you need to understand who Jessie was. A brilliant, kind-hearted soul, the kind of person everyone gravitated towards. Jessie was a talented musician. She could sing, play piano and violin, often losing herself in music for hours. One of her best friends growing up, Jacqueline Knights, recalls walking into Jessie's house and having to shout at the top of her lungs just to get her attention because Jessie was always at the piano. Jessie wasn't just talented. She had a fierce sense of justice. From a young age, she was deeply troubled by bullying and injustice of any kind. Jessie developed a strong moral compass, becoming an outspoken advocate for animal rights, environmentalism, sustainability, social justice, and ultimately the fight to end violence against women. By the time she graduated high school in 2012, Jessie was beloved by her peers, teachers, and parents alike. She had this wisdom about her that went beyond her years. She always talked about changing the world, and after high school, she started figuring out how she was going to do it. Jessie decided she wanted to become a choir director at a high school or university. It wasn't just about teaching music, it was about reaching and mentoring hundreds of young lives every year. She believed that through music, she could make a difference. In the fall of 2012, Jessie left Hartford for the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she enrolled in their music education program. She thrived in her first year, earning a talent scholarship for her sophomore year. When summer came, Jessie returned to Hartford to live with her parents. But unlike most college students, she didn't treat her summer break as a vacation. Instead, Jessie threw herself into her career. She started her own business, teaching voice, piano, and violin lessons to kids in the community. Within weeks, she had over 25 students signed up. When she wasn't teaching, Jessie spent her time writing original music with her friend Dan Bartelt, another talented local musician. She also auditioned for and landed a starring role in the local theater's summer production of Fiddler on the Roof. Jessie was cast as the fiddler, and she was thrilled. The musical opened on Friday, July 12, 2013, to a packed house, and Jessie and the rest of the cast were phenomenal. The next night, July 13th, there was another performance, and on Sunday, July 14th, they had a matinee. After that final show, the cast gathered at a pool party to celebrate the end of opening weekend. Jessie spent the evening laughing with her friends, sitting by the pool, and petting the llamas in a nearby field. It was the kind of carefree summer night you never forget. But when Jessie got home after midnight, her mom, Joy, noticed something was off. Jessie seemed upset. When Joy asked her if she was okay, Jessie hesitated before finally opening up. She explained that two older guys from the cast had been flirting with her, crossing boundaries that made her uncomfortable. These were people she considered friends, and their behavior had left her feeling unsettled. Still, Jessie brushed it off as nothing serious, just an annoyance. Little did anyone know that unease would soon give way to something far more sinister. After Jessie had confided in her mother about feeling uncomfortable with some of the older men in her theater group, the two said goodnight, and the house fell into its usual quiet. Joy had asked a few more questions, trying to gauge how serious Jessie's discomfort was, but it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. Both women soon retired to their rooms. The next morning, Buck and Joy were up fairly early, around 7 a.m. Jessie, still catching up on sleep, stayed in bed. She didn't have anything planned until around noon when she was scheduled to give a music lesson to one of her students at the house. Her parents knew she was sleeping in. She rarely had a chance to, and left her to rest. Buck left for work around 7:30 a.m., and at 8 a.m., before heading out herself, Joy brought some laundry up to Jessie's room. Quietly, she opened the door. Jessie was still asleep, her room bathed in the soft morning light. For a moment, Joy thought about waking her daughter just to say good morning, but then decided against it. Jessie was always busy, teaching, rehearsing, studying. She needed the rest. Joy left the laundry on a chair, slipped out of the room, and closed the door gently behind her. It wasn't until noon, when Joy came home for lunch, that she realized something was wrong. Walking through the door, Joy expected to find Jessie awake, probably prepping for her student's arrival. But the house was silent. Jessie's car was still in the driveway, so she hadn't gone anywhere. Annoyed, Joy walked to the bottom of the stairs and called up to her daughter. "Jessie, your student's going to be here any minute." When there was no response, Joy shrugged it off, heading into the kitchen to make herself something to eat. Time passed. Joy heard a knock at the door, and with growing frustration, opened it to find Jessie's student standing there, waiting for their lesson. Joy ushered the student inside, apologizing as she hurried up the stairs to Jessie's room. Maybe she'd overslept, Joy thought, but as she opened the bedroom door, nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. Jessie was still in bed, motionless. "Jessie!" Joy shouted, rushing to her daughter's side. As she stood over her, her breath caught in her throat. Jessie's face, once so full of life, was pale and still. Joy froze. For a moment, she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Then, in a panic, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911.
Oh my God.
Hartford 901, what's your emergency?
My daughter is blue. I went to wake her up, and I just got home from lunch, and she won't wake up.
She's
oh
19.
My God.
Okay, hang on just a second.
Okay.
Okay, so is she breathing?
I don't think so, no. Her pants are all wet, and she's got, it looks like strangulation marks.
There are strangulation marks?
That's what it looks like. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on.
In a state of shock, Joy pulled Jessie's body from the bed and laid her gently on the floor. She grabbed a pillow, placing it under her daughter's head, and began chest compressions. But it was already too late. By the time paramedics and police arrived, the tragic reality had set in. Jessie was gone. The officers carefully examined Jessie's body. The marks on her neck were unmistakable. Ligature marks, a telltale sign of strangulation. Similar marks were found on her wrists and ankles. Whoever had done this had tied her up. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't suicide. Jessie had been murdered. The house, once filled with the sounds of Jessie's music, was now eerily silent, transformed into a crime scene. As gently as they could, the police led Joy out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and into the living room where Buck had just arrived. His face was ashen with disbelief. Their only child, Jessie, their miracle, was gone. Their world had shattered in a single morning. While Joy and Buck tried to process their grief, detectives began to comb through Jessie's room for evidence. But strangely, there were no cords or ropes to be found, nothing that could have been used to strangle her. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house, no broken windows, no picked locks. and nothing appeared to be stolen. The investigation quickly zeroed in on a chilling possibility. This wasn't a random attack. Jesse had been targeted. Detective Richard Thickens, the lead investigator, theorized that the killer had known Jesse, someone who knew her schedule, her habits, and how to get into the house. Someone who came straight to her room, committed the murder, and then slipped away without a trace. A few hours after Jesse's body was found, Detective Thickens sat down with Buck and Joy to ask the agonizing question: did they know anyone who might want to harm their daughter? At first, Buck and Joy were at a loss. Jessie was loved by everyone. Who could possibly want to hurt her? But after more probing, Buck mentioned two things that had recently raised his concern. First, a crew had been working outside their house trimming tree limbs near Jessie's bedroom window. Could one of the workers have seen Jessie inside, a young woman alone in her room, and decided to take advantage? It seemed unlikely, but it was a lead. Then Buck brought up something more unsettling. That summer, along with teaching music, Jessie had taken a job at a local restaurant. Recently, she had mentioned a male coworker who had made her uncomfortable, someone who had been acting inappropriately toward her. Could that man have been involved? With these two potential leads, the investigation took on new urgency. But the sense of unease in Hartford was growing. Who would do this to someone like Jessie, and why? As the police searched for answers, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Whoever had done this had been deliberate, precise, and terrifyingly close to Jessie's life. As the investigation progressed, Jessie's parents provided more details that painted an unsettling picture of her final days. Jessie had mentioned to them a coworker at the restaurant who had been making her uncomfortable for some time. He would deliberately brush past her, invading her personal space, even though he knew it made her upset. In fact, Jessie had confided in her family about this man's behavior, which left them wondering, could this coworker have been seeking revenge for Jessie speaking out? And then there was the strange encounter Jessie had shared with her mother the night before she died. Jessie had come home clearly disturbed, mentioning how two older men from the cast had been hitting on her at a cast party. Although Jessie had downplayed the situation, it was obvious that something about it weighed heavily on her mind. Could it have been a more serious confrontation than she had let on? Detective Thickens, following these potential leads, wasted no time. He tracked down the tree trimmers who had been working near Jessie's window. After thorough interviews, they were ruled out as suspects. They had solid alibis. Next, he found and questioned Jessie's coworker. Again, despite the inappropriate behavior Jessie had described, the coworker also had an ironclad alibi and was swiftly cleared. That left the two older men from the cast party, the ones Jessie had mentioned to her mother the night before. One of them was quickly ruled out, but the other, Randy Talley, was not so easily dismissed. Randy was acting suspiciously, and his story didn't seem to add up. On July 15th, the day Jessie's body was discovered, Detective Thickens questioned Randy about his whereabouts. Randy denied any involvement, claiming that after the cast party, he had simply gone back to his apartment and stayed there alone for the rest of the night. When asked if there was anyone who could corroborate his story, Randy admitted that no one had seen him. He had been completely by himself. Meanwhile, back at Jessie's house, detectives were still combing through her belongings for clues. That's when they discovered something that made Randy seem even more suspicious: Jessie's diary. In her final entry, written shortly after she had returned from the cast party, Jessie expressed her frustration and discomfort with the behavior of two older cast members. She wrote that these men were corrupting her, turning what should have been platonic friendships into something twisted, a competition between them. Her last, haunting lines read, "I am not helpless. I will recognize problems and confront them without fear. God be with me." This diary entry, along with Randy's lack of an alibi, propelled him to the top of the suspect list. It seemed as though Jessie had been anticipating a confrontation. Had Randy been that confrontation? But then, something unexpected happened. Investigators reviewed Randy's cell phone records, which showed that he had not been in contact with Jessie, no calls, no texts, in the days leading up to her death. More importantly, at the time of her murder, Randy's cell phone was pinging off towers near his apartment, far from Jesse's home. While it was possible that Randy had left his phone at his apartment while committing the crime, this lack of evidence complicated things. With no physical proof linking Randy to the scene and no definitive motive, detectives were forced to reconsider. Was it possible that Randy, despite his suspicious behavior, wasn't responsible? With no clear evidence against Randy, the police found themselves back at square one, desperately searching for a new lead. And then, just 24 hours after Jesse's body was discovered, they got the break they needed. A young woman around Jesse's age had experienced something terrifying just 3 days before Jesse's death. On a quiet day in Richfield, Wisconsin, just 10 miles southeast of Hartford, 25-year-old Melissa Richards decided to take her dog, Remy, for a walk. Richfield is a small town, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever seems to happen, but that was about to change. Melissa pulled her car into the dirt parking lot of a local park. The lot was mostly empty, except for one vehicle, a blue minivan. The minivan was parked nose away from the entrance. As Melissa drove past it, she noticed something odd. The driver's legs were hanging out of the window, as if they were lying down across the front seats. She made a mental note of it, but didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it's a public park. People come and go. Melissa parked her car on the opposite side of the lot, got out, and let Remy out to start their walk. The trail she chose was a familiar one, a 30-minute loop through the woods, which would eventually bring her back to the parking lot. The idea of passing the blue van again didn't cross her mind, yet. Half an hour later, Melissa finished her walk and headed back toward her car. As she approached the lot, she noticed the van was still there, but this time, the driver's legs were no longer hanging out of the window. She couldn't see if anyone was inside. Still, Melissa wasn't overly concerned. She unclipped Remy's leash, allowing him to run ahead to the car. With her key fob in hand, she popped open the trunk, and Remy eagerly jumped inside. As Melissa crossed the lot toward her vehicle, she made a quick glance at the van and froze. The driver, who had been lounging earlier, was now sitting in the passenger seat of the minivan with the door wide open. He was staring directly at her. Melissa made brief eye contact with the man before quickly looking away, not wanting to seem rude or confrontational. She kept walking toward her car, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over her. But then she heard it. Footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps coming up behind her. Melissa whipped around and saw the man from the van running toward her. As soon as she turned to face him, he abruptly stopped, standing just about 10 feet away. His eyes bore into hers, but he said nothing. Just stood there, staring. In an attempt to ease the tension, Melissa nervously laughed and said, "Oh, you scared me." Then she turned and resumed walking toward her car, trying to keep her composure. But before she had taken more than a few steps, she heard the footsteps again. This time they were faster, more urgent. She spun around once more, and again the man stopped suddenly. But this time Melissa saw something that made her blood run cold. In his right hand, the man was holding a knife. In an instant, the man charged at her, tackling her to the ground. Melissa hit the dirt hard, landing on her stomach with the weight of the man pressing her down. She fought back, trying to twist beneath him, but the man was relentless. He tried to stab her, but in a surge of adrenaline, Melissa grabbed the blade with her bare hands. Blood poured from her fingers as she fought for control of the knife. Refusing to give in, Melissa managed to wrestle the knife away from her attacker, pinning it beneath her body. The man, clearly taken aback by her resistance, hesitated for a moment, seemingly unsure of what to do next. He reached down, trying to yank the knife out from under her, but Melissa held on with all her strength. For a brief, surreal moment, the man just sat there on her back and calmly asked, "Can I just go?" Melissa, in shock, responded, "No." But before she could react further, the man jumped up and ran back to the blue minivan. Shaken, but still running on adrenaline, Melissa scrambled to her feet, the bloody knife still in her hands. She ran to her car, threw the knife onto the floorboard of the passenger seat, and locked the doors. As she turned to look, she saw the man speeding away in the van, tires kicking up dirt as he disappeared down the road. Melissa's hands were shredded, covered in deep cuts from the struggle. Her body ached from being tackled, but she was alive. She quickly called the police, giving them a detailed description of the man, the van, and the attack. Officers arrived on the scene shortly after, but the attacker was long gone. The blue minivan and the man who had tried to kill her had vanished. This horrifying event left Melissa shaken but alive, a near victim of what could have been a senseless, brutal murder. After her terrifying ordeal, Melissa Richards found herself alone but determined. Shaken, bleeding from deep gashes in her hands, she drove herself to the hospital. There, she received 15 stitches to close the wounds caused by her attacker's knife. In her recovery room, she was visited by Detective Joel Klang of the Washington County Sheriff's Department. Despite the shock of the attack, Melissa had an extraordinary recall of the event. She described her attacker in vivid detail, down to the exact make and model of the vehicle, a Dodge Caravan minivan, likely from the years 2000 to 2002. She provided an impeccable account of both the man and the van, leading Detective Klang to commission a composite sketch of the attacker. Alongside the sketch, a description of the vehicle and the circumstances of the assault were widely circulated in the local media. The hope was that someone in the community would recognize the man or the van. Just a day after the brutal murder of 19-year-old Jesse Blodgett on July 16th, a deputy from the Washington County Sheriff's Department responded to the flyer. He recalled seeing a blue minivan matching the description in the exact same park just weeks before the attack on Melissa. The van had raised his suspicions at the time, as the driver had been acting strangely, so he had run the license plates. However, nothing alarming came up, and the deputy had dismissed the incident. Now, with Melissa's vivid description of the vehicle and the attacker, he retrieved the information he had logged from that day. The registered owner of the van didn't match Melissa's description at all. There was no way they were the same person. But Detective Klang wasn't satisfied with that coincidence. When he dug deeper, he discovered the van's owner had a relative who was a perfect match for the man in Melissa's description. That relative was 19-year-old Daniel Bartelt. On July 16th, while the Blodgett family held a vigil for their daughter Jessie, Detective Klang dialed Daniel Bartelt's number. At the time, Daniel was at the vigil, surrounded by Jessie's closest friends and family, mourning her loss. He had been a frequent visitor at the Blodgett household that summer, collaborating with Jessie on original music projects. As Daniel's phone rang, he quietly excused himself from the circle of grieving loved ones, stepping away to take the call. On the other end of the line, Detective Klang asked Daniel to come to the station to discuss the attack on Melissa Richards. Later that day, Daniel Bartelt arrived at the police station. Although the detectives initially questioned him about the attack on Melissa, they couldn't ignore the glaringly strange fact that Daniel had been at the vigil for Jessie, whose murder remained unsolved, just as he became a suspect in a violent attack that occurred only days earlier. As Daniel sat down for questioning, Detective Klang casually asked why he had been at Jessie's house when he called. Daniel explained that he was very close to Jessie, which was why he had attended the vigil. The detective slowly shifted the conversation to Melissa Richards, and while Daniel denied any involvement, they noticed something significant: cuts on his hands. The detectives pressed him about the injuries. Daniel claimed they were work-related, the result of a screw jutting out while he was moving inventory at an engineering company where he worked. But something about his story felt off. They probed deeper, asking him pointed questions about his job. Eventually, one of the detectives asked, "If I were to call your employer right now, would they confirm that you're still working there?" Daniel hesitated before admitting he had lost his job weeks earlier. His story about the cuts immediately fell apart. He had been lying about how he injured his hands. Sensing they were closing in on the truth, Detective Klang leaned forward and asked, "Daniel, how did you really hurt your hands?" Under pressure, Daniel confessed. He admitted that he had attacked Melissa Richards. He explained that after losing his job, he didn't want his parents to find out, so he had been pretending to go to work each day, leaving the house in the morning and returning in the evening. But instead of working, Daniel spent his days driving aimlessly around town, often parking in secluded spots like the one in Richfield, where he would sit in his van, idle and lost. On July 12th, the day he attacked Melissa, Daniel was once again pretending to be at work, sitting in the dirt parking lot where Melissa had parked. When he saw her, something inside him snapped. He said he had been feeling overwhelmed, scared of life, and simply wanted someone else to feel that fear too. So he decided to attack her. Despite this confession, when the detectives asked Daniel about Jesse Blodgett's murder, he firmly denied any involvement. He claimed he loved Jesse and would never hurt her, but Detective Kling wasn't convinced. He contacted Detective Thickens of the Hartford Police Department and told him to consider Daniel Bartelt as a suspect in Jesse's murder. It didn't take long for the Hartford detectives to discover that Daniel was lying once again. Daniel Bartelt had been raised in a loving, supportive family. He was a straight-A student, a talented musician, and highly respected by his peers and teachers. By all appearances, he was the kind of person who had everything going for him. But something had gone terribly wrong inside Daniel. In the weeks leading up to the attacks, Daniel had developed a disturbing obsession with violence, death, and murder. His internet search history revealed a dark descent into watching snuff films, graphic, real-life depictions of murder. He had spent hours reading about serial killers, particularly those who targeted women, and shortly before attacking Melissa, Daniel had become fixated on a specific snuff film. It depicted a woman being tied up, assaulted, and strangled, and Daniel watched it over and over. On the day of Melissa's attack, Daniel wasn't just sitting idly in his van. He was waiting for the right moment to recreate the horrors he had consumed online. Melissa had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Evidence recovered from the scene would later confirm this chilling theory. Strong, specialized tape, similar to that used in the snuff film Daniel had watched, had fallen out of his pockets during the attack. 3 days after Daniel Bartelt attacked Melissa Richards on July 15th, he sought to fulfill his dark fantasies once again. This time he planned meticulously. He didn't want to risk his victim fighting back as Melissa had. He needed someone who trusted him implicitly, someone who would allow him inside their home without question. His close friend, 19-year-old Jesse Blodgett. On the morning of July 15th, Jessie was home alone. Her parents, Buck and Joy, had left for work, and within minutes of their departure, Daniel pulled into the Blodgett family driveway. Witnesses later reported seeing his car in the area, but the exact sequence of events inside the house is still unknown. What is clear is that Jessie, feeling secure in the presence of a trusted friend, was completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Daniel entered the house carrying a bag filled with items that made his intentions clear. Ligatures, ropes, zip ties, alcohol wipes, and that same special tape he had used in the attack on Melissa. He made his way to Jessie's bedroom, where it's unclear whether she was awake or still sleeping. Regardless, Daniel wasted no time. He jumped on her, gagged her with a homemade ball gag, and secured it tightly with tape, ensuring that she couldn't make a sound. He then bound her wrists and ankles, hog-tying her, rendering her utterly helpless. What followed was a vicious sexual assault. When he was done, Daniel wrapped a cord around Jessie's neck and strangled her to death. The horror of the act was compounded by its cold precision. After killing her, Daniel attempted to clean her body using alcohol wipes and then carefully repositioned her under the bed covers to give the appearance that she was merely sleeping. Daniel meticulously gathered most of his supplies before leaving the house, but in his haste, he accidentally left behind one crucial piece of evidence, a roll of the special tape he had used to subdue both Jessie and Melissa. After leaving the scene of the murder, Daniel drove to Woodlawn Park, where he disposed of the remaining evidence in a trash can. The next day, Daniel attended Jessie's vigil, held by her grieving family and friends. By all accounts, he was the most talkative person there. interacting freely with others as they shared memories of Jesse. His outward behavior showed no signs of the monstrosity he had committed just a day before. In the weeks that followed, detectives built their case against Daniel Bartelt. The evidence was overwhelming, from the internet search history revealing his obsession with violence and snuff films to the tape left behind at Jesse's home. Eventually, Daniel was arrested and charged with Jesse's murder. Although he confessed to attacking Melissa Richards, he steadfastly denied any involvement in Jesse's death. During the trial, Daniel was found guilty of Jesse Blodgett's murder. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, he maintained his innocence. During the sentencing phase, Buck Blodgett, Jesse's father, gave a heart-wrenching speech about losing his only child. At the end of the speech, Buck turned to Daniel, who was sitting in the courtroom, and did something extraordinary. With tears in his eyes, Buck said, "Dan, I forgive you, as I have every day since I found out it was you." A moment later, he added, "Not only do I forgive you, but I love you." Daniel, when given the chance to speak, looked directly at Buck and Joy Blodgett. He denied any involvement in Jesse's murder, stating that he was innocent and had no answers for them. "My conscience is clear," he said. His words fell hollow in the face of the undeniable evidence. In the weeks that followed, detectives built their case against Daniel Bartelt. The evidence was overwhelming, from the internet search history revealing his obsession with violence and snuff films to the tape left behind at Jesse's home. Eventually, Daniel was arrested and charged with Jesse's murder. Although he confessed to attacking Melissa Richards, he steadfastly denied any involvement in Jesse's death. During the trial, Daniel was found guilty of Jesse Blodgett's murder. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, he maintained his innocence. During the sentencing phase, Buck Blodgett, Jesse's father, gave a heart-wrenching speech about losing his only child. At the end of the speech, Buck turned to Daniel, who was sitting in the courtroom, and did something extraordinary. With tears in his eyes, Buck said, "Dan, I forgive you, as I have every day since I found out it was you." A moment later, he added, "Not only do I forgive you, but I love you." Daniel, when given the chance to speak, looked directly at Buck and Joy Blodgett. He denied any involvement in Jesse's murder, stating that he was innocent and had no answers for them. "My conscience is clear," he said. His words fell hollow in the face of the undeniable evidence. Daniel Bartelt was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, he continues to deny his role in Jesse's death. In the wake of this unimaginable tragedy, Buck Blodgett was left with an unbearable burden. In the days following Jesse's death, he entered her bedroom and lay down on her bed. As he stared up at the ceiling, he tried to hold his breath, imagining what it must have been like for his daughter in her final moments, bound, gagged, and struggling for air. The thought crushed him. He felt the deep anguish of not being there when Jesse needed him most. But rather than letting that pain consume him, Buck and his family channeled their grief into something positive. They created the Love Before Hate Project, a charity aimed at ending male-on-female violence and carrying forward Jesse's vision of making the world a better place. Jesse had always wanted to change the world, and through this project, her legacy lives on. To learn more about Jesse Blodgett's story and to support the cause, you can visit the Love Before Hate Project on Instagram or Facebook. With Daniel Bartelt behind bars, the Blodgett family's home in Hartford holds more than just memories. It bears witness to a devastating loss. Yet through their grief, the Blodgetts have found a way to transform tragedy into a movement for change, ensuring that Jesse's light continues to shine despite the darkness that took her life.